The phrase fake news was not commonly part of the American vocabulary until the 2016 campaign, but the concept isn't new. Foreign agents have long posed as journalists while acting as spies. In his new book, Bureau of Spies, journalist and author Steven Usdin talks with Lisa Fletcher about the well-traveled intersection between journalism and foreign intelligence.
How likely do you think it is that there are spies among us being journalists?
Well, I think it's quite likely. It's almost certain. You know, look, there are thousands of journalists who are in the United States. So it's quite probable that some of them are cooperating with foreign intelligence agencies. I think that there are two kind of categories of journalists still who are involved in espionage. There are full-time intelligence officers who pretend to be journalists, and it's quite likely that there are still some of those in the United States. And then there are journalists who cooperate with intelligence agencies.
How the media represents the truth has become mainstream conversation. In fact, a lot of Americans see it as emergent. But the truth is that members of the media have been used by foreign governments for decades.
They have, but what's really important, I think, to understand and for people to understand is that that was the exception. Those are really exceptional cases, even though they're spectacular.
What about now? Is it less prevalent than it is believed to be?
The term now is fake news, and that's a very kind of a squishy term, very broad term. I prefer subversive propaganda, and I think there's a difference between reporters having an agenda or making mistakes, and what I call subversive propaganda, which is really foreign governments or other entities trying to deceive the American public, having a premeditated plan to deceive the American public. That's a different thing. That has obviously it happened to some extent during the 2016 elections. It is happening now, but I think that I think it's helpful to draw a distinction between that and this kind of broader idea that people have lack of confidence in the media.
How do you, as a journalist, how do you reconcile with all of these issues with your book talking about subversive propaganda / fake news and really sort of impugning our profession? There's
a kind of a short-term transactional attractiveness to both for journalists and for intelligence agencies to work together. But in the long run, it hurts both. American journalists cooperated quite closely with the CIA and with the FBI during the Cold War, and then that stopped really, or it slowed down tremendously as a result of the Vietnam War and the revelations of Watergate. They became a stigma associated with journalists cooperating with intelligence agencies. Journalists in other countries haven't necessarily had that experience, and I think that it's quite likely that there are journalists from other countries who think that it's a patriotic duty of theirs to cooperate with their intelligence agencies.
You write about a bartender at the National Press Club.
Johnny Prokop, yeah.
Yes, who was influential in diffusing the Cuban Missile Crisis. How did that happen?
There was an American reporter named Warren Rogers. He had been invited to go on this expeditionary force that potentially was going to invade Cuba, and he asked for a $300 advance so he'd have some pocket money with him if that happened. Unbeknownst to him, the bartender, his name was Johnny Prokop, who was a Russian from Latvia, overheard this conversation. So later, about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, a Russian reporter named Anatoly Gorsky came up to the press club bar, and he was actually KGB. And the bartender told him what he had heard. Gorsky immediately took the elevator, went down to the lobby of the press building, and ran to the Soviet embassy and told the KGB resident, the chief KGB officer in Washington, what he'd heard. He put that in a cable and sent it over to Moscow, and it landed on Khrushchev's desk. And according to research that Russian historians have conducted, that memo actually influenced Khrushchev's decision to turn the ships back and to defuse the Cuban Missile Crisis.
What's the message you're trying to get across with the book?
You know, I think some of the deeper messages are this idea that I have of the need to maintain a separation between intelligence and journalism. The fact that actually some of the methods that journalists and spies use are similar. You know, we both recruit sources. We're both trying to uncover things that secrets that aren't that other people are trying to prevent you from knowing about. Though there are similarities in some of the methods, they're really at cross purposes, and I think it's really critical to understand this distinction and to maintain this kind of arm's length relationship between journalism and intelligence.
Interesting connections he makes between fake news now and 50 years ago.
Right, because back then people generally believed that the media was telling the truth. So the challenge was to get people to believe that one false story was actually true. And now he says the purpose is totally different. It's to convince people that there is no such thing as truth, and if it exists, you don't get to know what it is.
Great interview.
Thanks.
Food for thought. Thanks, Lisa.